So this is how I envision it. Maybe at the very beginning, I would like to say just a few very brief words about the whole Epoché reading/discussion group thing. And then it would be nice if Matt could give us a little presentation of Whitehead and the book and his relevance. Nothing major, just a very short intro. And then I would suggest that we just, briefly introduce ourselves. Some people are more well known than the others in this group, but yeah, just so that we know where we're coming from and what we're interested in, and so on and so forth. So basically, Epoché is one of the sections of the Metanoia group and was actually the first one to take place. And the idea behind it was very simple. I just wanted to create a reading group of sorts where I could meet with some of my best students and discuss some of the works I wanted to discuss with someone. And given the fact that there aren't that many colleagues at the faculty that would be interested in these particular topics or authors, this seemed like a very convenient thing to do. So me and Timothée and Adnan and Fabian, and we were later joined by Victoria, and also Isaac, who is not here today. We started to meet so every 2 weeks, and we started off with the structure of behavior by Merleau-Ponty, and after that we transitioned to phenomenology of perception, which we were working on for 1 year, one whole year, and then we moved on to Goldstein and Canguilhem. Well, eventually this small gathering kind of started to evolve, and we established the Metanoia group, which hopefully will become a formal institute soon. And I'm hoping that we would be able to pursue some of the activities that we're pursuing now in a more formal setting, that is. So just to reiterate, if anybody's interested, all the activities of the Metanoia group are available at our site, which was created mostly by Primož and Adnan initially, and now is being updated also by Eva. So yeah, I mean, we're trying to be as active as possible. There are many ideas that we're trying to put through. So Epoché is one of these activities that we're working on. So the regular reading/discussion group. So far, it has been very efficient. In addition to having these meetings, what we normally do is we also publish the abbreviated content of each paragraph or of paragraphs that we have been discussing on the site, alongside with the main questions or discussions that we had, so that everybody can revisit in case he or she is interested. So, and we've also decided to record these sessions just so that we have this archived. We've seen now with the Varela event how useful that can be, actually. If things would have been recorded back then, it would be really nice to revisit some of the things. But luckily enough, we have people like Evan who can then, provide this type of material almost as if it were recorded. So, okay, after Merleau-Ponty, Goldstein, and Canguilhem, we're moving on to Whitehead. Now, after that, as a sort of a spoiler, we will be doing also Plessner's Stufen, so Plessner's levels of organic life and the human, and Gilbert Simondon's individuation in light of notions of form and information. So after that, we'll probably move on to Kant if we get it that far. But that's the general outline of the things that are to come. So one of the reasons for Whitehead is because there has been a growing interest, basically, also in this group for authors' philosophy, for Whitehead's philosophy. Micha in particular is working very, very diligently on Whitehead. And also myself and Timothy, we've also started to dabble in Whitehead's philosophy. And me and Adnan, we've received a grant from the UK to translate this bad boy into Slovene. So this is something that's also currently happening. So it's a very timely reading group, I would say. Yeah, so that's basically it. That's the background. That's the general idea, general history of Epoché and how it fits into the whole metanoia scheme. And we can say a little bit more about the sessions later on. I would suggest, Matt, if it's okay with you, I would kindly ask you to maybe I have to give you the permission, right? Yeah. To share the screen, you need to share the screen. If not, no?
No, I don't have any slides or anything.
Okay, marvelous. Then I would kindly ask you to just, lead us into Alfred Whitehead and his philosophy and why he's relevant for contemporary philosophical and scientific thought.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Seb, and nice to be here with everyone to study a figure who has been, I guess, right at the center of my research for, gosh, like 12 or 13 years now. And it's gotten to the point where I'm almost a little bit, I wouldn't say I'm tired of studying Whitehead. I'll never be tired of studying Whitehead, but I'm ready to kind of move on to the next phase. But there's so much interest in Whitehead now that I keep being asked to talk about him, and students that come to CIIS want to study him. And so I don't think I'll ever be done reading Whitehead. So just to say a bit about what led up to this book, which was a series of lectures originally called the Lowell Lectures that Whitehead gave in Boston in 1925, just several months after arriving in the United States, when he was invited by Harvard to teach in the philosophy department. But before this, Whitehead, of course, was a professor of mathematics at Cambridge University. He was important in the development of mathematics, certainly with Bertrand Russell with the Principia Mathematica, but even before that, Whitehead published a book called Universal Algebra in 1898, which eventually got him invited into the Royal Society. And from that point, he published a series of papers in the early 1900s, most important of which was in 1905, same year as Einstein published his 3 important papers. Whitehead published a paper called Mathematical Conceptions of the Material World. He was not yet aware of Einstein, but he was trying to develop, and throughout his life really was interested in the ways in which mathematics could be used to model space and eventually to model space-time. And in this 1905 paper, Whitehead begins to gesture towards a relativistic understanding of space and time. The honor of really cementing that connection belongs to Einstein, of course. And once Whitehead became aware of Einstein, it was this relativistic paradigm shift in the physical sciences that really pulled Whitehead out of his work with Russell and the foundations of mathematics into the philosophy of science initially. He published 3 really important books: Principles of Natural Knowledge in 1919, The Concept of Nature in 1920, and The Principle of Relativity in 1922, where he actually offers an alternative rendering, his own tensor equations and mathematical formalization of relativity theory to provide an alternative to Einstein's approach, which didn't require, Whitehead's version does not require the notion of curved space, which is something Whitehead found to be epistemologically problematic because it would undermine our ability to measure things. As far as I can tell, there's still some controversy here around the extent to which Whitehead understood Einstein, the extent to which Einstein could understand Whitehead. They did get a chance to meet in 1922 to talk about this at Lord Haldane's house, who was a British politician and philosopher. But either the translation, the language gap, Einstein, his English wasn't good yet. He had just kind of become famous a few years earlier. Whitehead's German wasn't good enough, or they just had some fundamental metaphysical disagreements. And so after this phase of writing about the philosophy of science with these 3 books I mentioned, Whitehead then is invited to Harvard in 1924. He arrives in August. He would begin teaching his first philosophy course at Harvard in September. As he put it in his first lecture, it was also his own first philosophy course. He had never taken a philosophy course before. And then in 1925, February, I believe, he is invited to Boston to give the Lowell Lectures, which became Science in the Modern World. And this book is, it offers, I think, a really unique telling of the history of science and the so-called scientific revolution. As we'll see, Whitehead draws connections between the theology that was prevalent in Europe in the 17th century and prior to that, and shows how science emerged in the context of this European theological mentality for a reason. And yet he also describes science as a revolt against the extreme rationalism of the scholastic tradition, which is odd. You don't often hear historians of science talking about the irrationalist revolt of the early modern scientists. But what Whitehead means is that they're turning away from Aristotle, and they're starting to do experimental studies. They're more empirical, and they're less concerned with the systematic connections between all of reality. And they really just, these early modern scientists wanted to use mathematics, quantitative analysis of that aspect of nature that could be measured. And for Whitehead, whereas the Aristotelians wanted to categorize everything, these early scientists started to quantify things, and the scientific revolution was off and running. Now, Whitehead champions science, but he's also critical of its tendency to commit the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, right? Which is one of the more famous statements and ideas that you see cited in many other works of philosophy and the history of philosophy. If Whitehead is mentioned, it's usually for this notion of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And he develops that first in this book.
It's either that or the idea of bifurcation of nature. That's the other
right.
one that's normally mentioned. These two.
Right. Which the bifurcation of nature is a notion he articulates in The Concept of Nature in 1920. In Science in the Modern World, though, he's not only doing the history of science, he's talking about the philosophy of religion, aesthetics, and romantic poetry. And there's a whole chapter in here called The Romantic Revolt, which is this poetically inspired rejection of a mechanistic view of the universe. And Whitehead both wants to, he does deeply value the Romantic poets, Wordsworth in particular, but he's also trying to preserve a sense of the importance of science and the value of science. So he's doing history of science, the philosophy of religion, aesthetics, ethics. There's a whole, the last chapter, Requisites for Social Progress, was really prescient in its understanding of he doesn't use the term ecology yet, but the way in which this mechanistic understanding of nature was ignoring the values intrinsic to the natural environment, and so was allowing industrialization to go about destroying the natural world, because we literally did not have the eyes to see the damage that was being done, but Whitehead did. There are some rather difficult chapters in here on abstraction, where Whitehead's beginning to develop some of the ideas which would be, I think, more coherently articulated and systematized in later books, especially Process and Reality, which was published 4 years later. But you really get a sense, reading Science in the Modern World, for the process by which Whitehead would arrive at his metaphysics. This book is kind of transitional, right? His earlier 3 books in the 1919 to 1922 were more philosophy of science. In this book, he's now beginning to step into metaphysics and cosmology. But he doesn't fully complete that transition, I would say, until Process and Reality several years later, after he's had a chance to lecture at Harvard and work out his ideas with his students. He would teach philosophy of science, and I think the other course was philosophical presuppositions of modern science. He would teach these courses at Harvard, but there was no textbook. He would pretty much just lecture about whatever he was thinking about himself, and hope that his students could point out what wasn't clear. And really, he wanted to develop his own ideas with his students. And so I think that's a good place to leave it. Hopefully that gives you a sense for the context of this book in Whitehead's overall body of work. So yeah, thanks for the invitation to do that, Seb.
Yeah, marvelous. Thank you very much, Matt. Maybe just a short subsequent question, if you don't mind. What would you say? Why is Whitehead becoming more and more? Why is the interest for Whitehead becoming more and more prominent? It would seem that there is a bit of some sort of a renaissance, Whiteheadian renaissance, that we're currently witnessing. And it's interesting, sometimes you get the impression that's as if you were watching, the stock market. You have stocks that go down and then they are stagnant for a while and then all of a sudden pick up again. Whitehead was, when Gabor from Mind and Life Europe, who basically he's now director, and he originally started off as a Whiteheadian scholar. I think he even translated Process and Reality into Hungarian, which is just brutal. So, and he said that when he started, he had exactly three people who he could correspond with on Whitehead in Europe. So 3 people were working on Whitehead at that period. And now all of a sudden, here we are, and we have young, aspiring students interested in reading Whitehead. And, Evan is here, you're here, Matthias is here. So it's fascinating to see this shift. What would you say is the reason for this? You could put it in a nutshell, or you can take it wherever you want.
Yeah, gosh, Process and Reality into Hungarian. I just wrote a book on Whitehead, and I kind of think of this as an attempt to translate Process and Reality into English, if you know what I mean. Just to introduce people. Now that there's more interest in Whitehead, I get asked a lot, where do I start? And there's really no good book to start. I mean, often I'll recommend Science in the Modern World, but it really depends on the background of the person who's asking. If they have more of a scientific and mathematical background, I would maybe have them start with those 3 books in the early 1920s, or 1919 through 1922. But why is there this Whitehead Renaissance? Well, I mean, one of the issues is that 100+ years after these, I mean, it's really like the early 20th century is like the second scientific revolution. The old Newtonian Cartesian conception of the universe was demolished. I mean, Whitehead will say in this book that when he was a student at Cambridge, it was as though physics was almost a done deal. They just needed to tie up a few loose ends, and then we'd have a more or less complete understanding of the physical universe. And then through a series of discoveries in the 1890s, and then of course with Einstein and then quantum theory, that settled picture of the cosmos was unsettled, to say the least. And so even now, 100 years later, there are various contender theories for unifying relativity and quantum theory, but most of them can't even be empirically tested because they're so mathematically speculative. If just within quantum theory, many quantum physicists are trained to not even attempt to offer some ontological interpretation of what the math means. Highly predictive theory, right? And it's very accurate enough to make microprocessors for us to be able to do this right now. But when it comes to describing the nature of nature, often quantum theory is an invitation to all sorts of new age woo, and consciousness creates the world and all this stuff. And so Whitehead, I think, is becoming more relevant because he offers a coherent, logically consistent, empirically adequate, and applicable metaphysical scheme wherein relativity and quantum theories can be understood as part of one universe, because right now they do different universes in the standard reading. But not only that, Whitehead's also offering a way of bringing our knowledge of the physical universe into coherence with our understanding of the biological world, our understanding of what's now called evolutionary cosmology, where the entire cosmos is understood more as a cosmogenesis, as a process of unfolding, where biological evolution becomes like a special case of a much broader cosmic process of evolution. And so, he's one of the few in the 20th century that undertook the task of a grand metaphysical system. He calls it a scheme, not a system, and we can get into why, what the difference might be there. But I think also the other thing is the ecological crisis and the challenge that is bringing to our epistemologies and our understanding of what, how to best understand the community of life on Earth. And that it seems there's more and more of a recognition that a mechanistic understanding of nature is not only incorrect, but damaging, because it has guided our practice. It has it allowed us to justify a certain mode of political economy. And now that this is being brought more into question, there's this search for alternative ways of doing science, alternative conceptions of the universe. And, Whitehead is just waiting for us to catch up with him still, I think, on a lot of these questions. And yeah, the University of Edinburgh is releasing a new critical edition of all of Whitehead's books, including a lot of material that has not yet been published. There's 2 volumes out so far of lecture notes from his students at Harvard. And so, this renaissance is just beginning. I think it's going to continue as this new critical edition comes out. And, who knows, maybe another generation from now, Whitehead will be really have cemented a place among the most important philosophers of the 20th century.
Thanks for this. What I find it so interesting with regards to Whitehead, to me, it seems that he's a segment in a larger narrative that is now being rediscovered. The first part of the 20th century was just brimming with brilliant people with brilliant ideas. For example, the German-speaking countries were just full of people who were developing outstanding that were doing outstanding philosophical work and scientific work. And then it seemed that with the beginning of the Second World War, many of these things were just forgotten. They somehow couldn't find their place in what happened in the aftermath. There was this stark division within philosophy, and some authors were just cast by wayside, or were forgotten, or were kind of destined to be dealt with only in smaller circles of philosophers, usually speaking language that unfortunately was not, dominant in the global scheme of things. So, for instance, before you joined us, Matt, we were talking about Plessner, and then we have authors like Merleau-Ponty and Kurt Goldstein and Simon Don, and there's a whole bunch of these authors who were working some of them in the first part of the 20th century, and they were all somehow trying to engage in a critical dialogue with science, where they weren't bashing science completely, but were trying to kind of show that science is also, in a certain sense, a philosophical project, and that one can have a meaningful and intelligent discussion about the philosophical framework in which science is being done. And I think that you're right, that many of the pertinent crises that we're currently witnessing have kind of brought this on. Anyway, any other thoughts on this, particularly from those of you who have maybe already dabbled in Whitehead, as to why we're having this Whitehead renaissance?
I would like to add something with regards to what I guess Whitehead means for our reading groups specifically, which I find also very interesting, because as you said, Sebastian, we did, of course, Goldstein, Cugniem, Merleau-Ponty. What I find interesting here that we're doing Whitehead now is it represents, I guess, a kind of contrast, really. And I'm using contrast because it is a kind of Whiteheadian notion, because Whitehead's philosophy is, I guess, more metaphysically inclined, or I guess more or less metaphysical philosophical system, right? Or right, as opposed to what we've been doing with other authors who are, I guess, dabbling more in epistemological questions. And I think this contrast of epistemology, metaphysics is, well, quite welcome.
Thanks for this. Anyway, that's a good point. If anybody else would like to add anything, if not, maybe we could go. Oh, Evan, yeah.
Well, just one thing. I think Matt gave a really good description of, the reasons for interest in Whitehead. I would just add that there's actually been kind of an undercurrent of interest in Whitehead for a long time. And it depends what your frame of reference is. So, for example, I'm a philosophy professor in North America. So although I've spent a lot of time in Europe, so my frame of reference is generally sort of how philosophy gets institutionally defined in the North American philosophy department. And there, Whitehead is very rarely talked about, and still is very rarely talked about. But nevertheless, there has been an undercurrent in that context of interest in him for decades. And some of it is connected to what's called process theology, which is its own intellectual subculture, I suppose we could say, but not all of it. Some of it has been in the philosophy of science. Some of it has been in metaphysics. Some of it has been in the philosophy of nature. And my perception is that it kind of bubbles up. It's always there, like an underground spring, and then it kind of bubbles up, here and there for different reasons. Some of them have to do with the need for some kind of comprehensive ecological philosophy, as Matt was saying, the need to put together, a sophisticated philosophy of science and philosophy of nature with the demand for thinking ecologically. And that connects Whitehead to a number of other thinkers. So that's kind of one, maybe larger cultural reason, I suppose, why Whitehead would be of interest. I think also there's connections, this connects to something you were saying, Sebastian, where there are other thinkers in the 20th century who, we could write different narratives of the history of 20th century philosophy. different ones from the standard ones that were given, especially in North America. You know, we're sort of in North America, we're given the line that kind of runs from, you know, as a result of World War II, the kind of fracturing of German-speaking philosophers into, you know, positivism and then analytic philosophy on the one hand, and then what we strangely in North America call continental philosophy, which is like continental breakfast. It doesn't make any sense, but that's where you put, you know, figures like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. And it's a completely artificial narrative. It makes no sense historically. It makes no sense geographically, but it came to be that way because of the development of philosophy in North America institutionally. And so Whitehead doesn't fit into that. And other thinkers like Bergson doesn't fit into that. Bergson, interestingly, like Whitehead, you know, was originally a mathematician and then works on very many of the same topics that Whitehead works on. They actually liked each other quite a bit. You know, works on issues having to do with time and nature and consciousness and the will. And so you could write an alternative narrative, as indeed, you know, figures like Deleuze, you know, writes an alternative narrative of the history of philosophy. So it's just to say that that there are always these possibilities of writing different histories and of these figures who go underground, but who are very much alive and then pop up again. And I think, you know, this meeting that we're having is an instance of another reason why Whitehead pops up and another place where Whitehead pops up. And I think, you know, the sort of general way I would summarize that, and I think this is actually what Matt said as well, is that we still haven't really digested Whitehead. We, you know, I would argue that we have actually digested thinkers like Heidegger, and I would even say, you know, Derrida and thinkers like that. I actually think we pretty much digested them. Not everybody would agree with me on that, but, you know, I would be willing to argue that. But I don't think we've digested Whitehead at all. I mean, by digest, I mean really assimilated, taken him up metabolically, used him in our own, you know, life, and then synthesized something new out of it. I don't think we've done that yet. You know, there are thinkers who I think have taken up trying to do that. You know, Matt's working on Whitehead, you know, Stongers has, you know, her, you know, big study of Whitehead. So there are certainly people who have taken up this task, but I don't think in general in philosophy or culturally for that matter, we've done it. We've done the necessary work. And that's why Whitehead keeps coming up. One more thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is that I was introduced to Whitehead really young because my dad was very much captured by Whitehead when he was an undergraduate student. And when he wrote his undergraduate thesis, Whitehead played a big role in it. And this was in the context of, you know, Whitehead kind of being seen as passé in the 1950s. And, you know, philosophy of language, it was on the ascendancy, which, you know, was exemplified by, you know, figures like J.L. Austin. And my dad was not interested in that at all, but was very interested in Whitehead. So he kind of introduced me to Whitehead at a very young age. And one thing that always stuck in my mind, you know, he would say this repeatedly, but I must have first heard it when I was, I don't know, 11 or 12 or something. He said, you know, if the world is ever going to put itself back together again after, you know, the Industrial Revolution and what we would today call the climate crisis, it's going to be with Whitehead. Those were his words, is that like Whitehead was the thinker who we really needed to help us do that, which doesn't mean that we like all of a sudden become Whiteheadians and sort of follow it in a like slavishly disciple way, but it's that it's a necessary resource for us to find our way out of the cultural, scientific, ecological crisis that we're in. So that's, you know, I think why Whitehead remains, you know, really important.
Those are really good points. And going back to those authors that you mentioned that we digested, I would even say that we've indigested some pretty heavily.
There's always that can happen too.
And now we're seeing the results.
You just didn't have the right wine with it, Sebastian.
It would seem so. Yeah, maybe just this is a short aside, but you know, these differences between the backgrounds that we were kind of working in and that we were formed in. For instance, for someone who studies philosophy in Ljubljana, it's a common place to be acquainted with Heidegger and Husserl and Lacan and authors like this very early on. For someone in the States nowadays, especially, this might seem, wow, that's like really, you know, illuminating and very, in a certain sense, progressive. But it's not necessarily so. For you, they are just these authors that you know, you're kind of confronted with, not necessarily in the best of ways, but it's a very different experience. And like you yourself said, Evan, this Whiteheadian undercurrent that was present in the form of process theology, which is basically a beast of its own in a certain sense. You know, the same was true, for instance, for the Heideggerian philosophy that we were presented with here, for instance. This Heideggerian philosophy in the Slovene context developed in a very, very special milieu, and it developed as a reaction against the orthodox socialist philosophy at the times. So it was not only about Heidegger, it was also a bit of a pose, you know. So this is why it always had a specific tinge where a certain level of obscurantism was not necessarily frowned upon. It was something that was just part of the image. So it was not just, you know, like reading Dreyfus or someone in the Anglo-American world, where you really have this attempt similar to the one that Matt presented, where he tried to translate Whitehead into English. Our Heideggerians wrote and spoke Heideggerian. So it was a very unique experience, not one you might necessarily feel strongly drawn towards, unless, of course, you know, for some reason felt a certain attraction in just, you know, a specific type of speaking. Yeah, it's an interesting, these differences can be quite interesting, and it's not necessarily helpful if you are being presented with a certain author. It also depends on how how this author is presented, in what context and whatnot. Because my original reaction when I was presented with Heidegger's philosophy was one of aversion. So, you know, for me, this was something I did not want to pursue. But eventually, when I rediscovered Heidegger on my own, and I realized that this is basically a very specific interpretation, a very specific way of basically developing his philosophy that has a certain background, a certain history, it is only then that I started to really appreciate what he has done and, you know, some of his main ideas. Yeah, so it's sometimes it's not necessarily a bad thing if if a given author is you know, left if he or she is not being actively dealt with by the academics.
Can I say a brief word about process theology? Has come up a few times.
But this was not meant as a critique. You know, when I was drawing the parallel, I wasn't trying to say that process theology is to Whitehead what Slovene Heideggerians are to Heidegger. This was not what I tried to say.
That came across. I didn't hear it as a critique, but I did want to just say a bit more, just as a just deepening the reception history of Whitehead. I mean, as Evan was saying, there's this underground current that's been there all along, but just to mitigate against the idea that somehow Whitehead went into cold storage in the 50s and wasn't touched again until recently, that's not at all the case. I mean, the Center for Process Studies down in Claremont, where the process theological perspective was was brought forth. I mean, originally at the University of Chicago, Charles Hartshorne was there. There was a whole school of Whiteheadians at the University of Chicago. That's where John Cobb Jr. Studied Whitehead, and then came to Claremont later to found the Center for Process Studies. But John Cobb Jr. and David Ray Griffin and others over decades, while they were certainly developing Whitehead's relevance to liberal progressive theology, they were also hosting conferences across every discipline you could imagine to bring Whitehead into dialogue with the sciences, all the different special sciences, the arts, education, economics. I mean, there was sort of a crescendo of this, the achievement of the Center for Process Studies back in 2015. They had this huge conference called Seizing an Alternative. And, just to give you a sense for the sections that they had at this conference, I think there were probably 1,500 people there, many of whom were coming over from China, where Whitehead is also exploding right now. I mean, they have 30 graduate programs or something just devoted to process thought, 2 billion people. So it's relative, but still, that's a lot of graduate programs. But this conference had sections on collapsology, philosophy, of course, psychological alienation from nature and sort of like eco-psychology, world religions, education, somatics and bodily health, agriculture, sociology, cultural critique, the arts, and so on, theology, of course. And so it just, what the process theologians did, I think, for Whitehead studies is not only kept Whitehead alive, but started all these conversations with other disciplines. And it's I think we owe them a lot in terms of advancing Whitehead studies, when for the most part, in North America in particular, there wasn't, nobody had much time for Whitehead. But there are dozens of books that came out of these conferences over the years that are still a valuable resource that, we can turn to see what would a Whiteheadian approach to evolutionary biology be. There's several books about that, bringing biologists together into a conference to discuss the issue. So I just wanted to say a word for the Center for Process Studies there.
Yeah, that's marvelous, and that's a very good point. And I definitely agree, and that there were people that were working on Whitehead even during these more dry periods, as one might call them. But I would say that in general, there wasn't, like, you get the impression where there is a certain hunger or thirst for a given author, where all of a sudden not only are certain specialists engaging with his or her philosophy, but all of a sudden, there's this, he becomes or she becomes a staple name of sorts. And during the times that you were describing, I think that many students were interested in Whitehead's thought, but then eventually got caught up into something else. And I think a couple of months ago, or it was even longer than that, I heard a talk by Rorty, where he basically says that when he was a student, he got really, really interested in Whitehead. But then he discovered Wittgenstein. And all of a sudden, his fascination with Whitehead waned. And I think that this was the experience of many American students, and also many, say, students in England at that particular time. But this too eventually kind of faded and changed. So this, let's say, Wittgensteinian, trying to get out of the language game trap philosophy. And now people are becoming more interested again in authors that, I don't know, Miha used the term metaphysical, and it's a correct term, I would say, but there's still like a specific sub-meaning to it. But yeah, to more metaphysical reflection in general, let's put it that way, or ontological reflection, whichever you would like to phrase it. Anyway, Primož, you wanted to ask something or comment.
Yeah, my comment was related that on one hand, you have these neglected thinkers, but I feel like sometimes we are drawn into the opposite extreme when we are trying to rediscover these old thinkers, and maybe we go too far in kind of idolizing them. And I feel like that there's a certain danger in that when you were listing all the various graduate programs basically dedicated just to this one thinker, and whole groups forming around just one thinker. I feel like there's a real danger of forming a bubble because of that. And I'm not sure how much that really contributes to this holistic development of science, or do we just have a bunch of people dedicated to one thinker and then another group? I'm not sure how that will really span out over time. I know Plesner, for example, he cautions us towards being too eager to put various theories together and for restoring all oral theories and so forth, that we should kind of maintain a critical attitude towards it and not to become too obsessed with certain thinkers, which I completely understand, because I just went through this exact experience with Plesner of just hating him initially and then becoming like really falling in love in a certain sense in the way he talks. And also Sebastian was talking about the Heideggerian the Slovene tendency of really talking about everything in these Heideggerian tones and just translating the entirety of Plato in a certain Heideggerian vein. And yeah, it's I think it brings with it a lot of dangers that maybe sometimes we overlook as we try to do this archivist work of resuscitating the forgotten thinkers. Yeah,
sure, this is what happens. You kind of overreach, and then after a while, these new trends. For instance, you know, the Slovene Heideggerians I was talking about, and it seemed like as if I were bashing them. I wasn't really. They did a really important job, but after a while, you know, they just kind of grew old and a bit static, and they were just doing their own thing, not realizing that it was completely out of sync with what was happening among the students. But in the 80s, for instance, when they emerged, they were like an event as a capital E, with a capital E. For instance, a Slovene philosopher, Gorazd Kocijančić, who is probably the most well-known Roman Catholic philosopher, but of a very special type. He at one point described the conference when he attended, where Hribar, who was the lead protagonist of Slovene Heideggerians, was about to have a talk. So as he was, you know, climbing the stage, he said that all of a sudden the whole room fell completely silent. This was in the 80s, you know, in the socialist era. And he was about to have a talk on Heidegger, who was already then associated with Nazism. And already that fact alone was, you know, a very powerful performative. And then he gave a talk, and 80% of people didn't know what he was talking about, but everybody was listening attentively throughout the whole lecture. And after that, apparently, you know, there was a slew of criticism and attacks from the mainstream socialist thinkers, and he was just kind of fending them off, apparently, with style. So, you know, there's an interesting story to say about all of this. And this rediscovery of Heidegger in this particular context then led to a very specific way of presenting Heidegger, which had its flaws, and eventually led to, just as I said, becoming out of sync with many other currents that were developing. But it kind of had its time, it played its role. And I think that, yeah, you know, this is probably something that is almost impossible to avoid. There will always be people that will be developing certain groups in a reaction to something else, which doesn't necessarily mean that this is something that Epoché and Metanoia have to pursue.
It's actually something I was thinking about while reading a few of the beginning chapters of Pierre Hadot's Philosophy as a Way of Life, where he basically talks about how philosophy often develops in this fashion, that you have this starting group of curious philosophers just chatting and really being having these wild ideas about the world and discussing them. But then it slowly institutionalizes. You get a group which follows these ideas, and then basically it becomes devoted to the exegesis of the interpretation of the original group's ideas. And I feel like that's something that, which happens in science and philosophy all the time. You have a thinker who doesn't find immediate acceptance, and then a little later a group forms up which rediscovers him, and then gets goes a little too far with it, and then again you have a counter reaction.
A bit of a Kuhnian scheme there.
One of the things that's interesting about this, I don't know what to call it, this dynamic of philosophical theater and cultural fads, really, in a way, is that makes Whitehead different, is that there's not really a cult of personality around Whitehead in the way that there is for somebody like Heidegger or Wittgenstein or Derrida. Like, I spent a good part of my time in the 1980s in France, and I'd go to lectures by people like Derrida and Lyotard and Foucault, and I mean it's like a cult of personality basically around these figures, and it's an event to go to their lectures. I mean, that makes it fun because everybody's watching everybody, and there's the theater and all of this sort of social well, it's an exercise in the phenomenology of intersubjectivity at any rate. But Whitehead's not like that. There isn't a cult of personality around Whitehead in the same way. He was very self-effacing as a person. He didn't foreground his ego. He according at least to one story, didn't want his papers preserved. I mean, it's maybe not quite so straightforward, but there is an element of that in his own self-conception of what he leaves to posterity, unlike Heidegger, who just was maniacal about preserving everything in a particular format for future generations. So that's, an interesting feature as well, just the personalities of these figures. And I've always, I don't know if I were to have met Whitehead, what I would have felt, but I've always at a distance felt him as a very sympathetic and humane figure in a way where I certainly can't say that about Heidegger or even Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's a more complicated case, but anyway, it's an interesting thing to think about, that aspect of it.
For sure. What you said with regards to Heidegger and his maniacal tendency of having everything preserved reminded me of when he was prohibited from delivering, from having lectures at the universities, and then through his friends he was invited to deliver these local lectures at, say, Mercedes-Benz groups or something like that. And then you have, this lecture was then published. And when you read this lecture, you can hardly understand some of it, or it's very difficult. And I have no idea whatsoever, how people who were sitting there, people from Mercedes-Benz, and were listening to Heidegger giving his lecture on, I don't know how you say it in English, but Chetveria, the fourfold or something like that. This is the late concept in Heidegger. So yeah, this is, I think, also perhaps, an expression of this tendency that you mentioned, where you simply don't care and you just go and do your thing regardless. Okay, Micha.
Well, just a brief comment about Wittgenstein and Whitehead. I totally agree with the portrait of Whitehead's character that Evan was just sharing. And the only time I've ever heard Whitehead say something disparaging about another person was Wittgenstein, who he said was insufferable to be around. They were around Cambridge at the same time. Russell loved Wittgenstein. I mean, Russell struggled with his personality too, but Whitehead found him insufferable. I think Whitehead was also upset by Wittgenstein's treatment of women. Anscombe was the one exception, perhaps, but Whitehead was an advocate for women's suffrage and educational access and everything. And Wittgenstein would often just stop lecturing if women walked into the classroom. So anyways, besides his distaste for Wittgenstein, he was a very congenial, mild-mannered, and polite gentleman.
I didn't know that. Thanks for this intervention. I didn't know that he actually said something disparaging against Wittgenstein. He was a special character for sure, Wittgenstein. Okay, Micha, and then maybe we can move on to the presentations.
Yeah, I just remembered something that actually Victor Love wrote in his biography, and I think he used the phrase benign sage for Whitehead. And I don't know if he used it in a negative way, because I think it really does apply to a kind of Victorian gentleman that Whitehead was. Yeah.
Benign sage, huh? Nice. Okay, so maybe we can wrap this meeting up by offering short self-introductions. Maybe we can say, just who we are and what we do, what our interests are, and maybe also if this would be something that would be of interest to you, what do you expect to gain from these meetings, or why you find Whitehead interesting? So I'll just switch to the gallery view, and if you don't mind, I'll be calling your names as they appear on my screen. Is that okay? Who was your first, because you're recording?
Damn, unfair. I'm Primož. I studied philosophy, and I'm finishing a degree in cognitive science, but I'm also a musician, writing my own music. I've been working on my master's thesis, like I've said so many times, on comparing Helmut Plessner's levels of organic life with in activism, or specifically with Varela's in activism. And I guess after Sebastian invited me to this reading group, I kind of discovered a bunch of these thinkers, which I don't think were really mentioned all that often during my studies of philosophy. And although I'm not specifically so much interested on this, I don't know how exactly to put it, this more low level and the low level discussions here, like I don't know how to define life. What I'm interested in is stuff like culture, art, religion, but I would like to kind of bridge the gap between these two levels of not having to, because I feel like you always had these discussions held as separate. On the one hand, you have something like biology and nature, and on the other, it's culture, and it's very difficult to find discussions which really unite these two discourses. For example, Heidegger, he's basically on this, he's just kind of stuck in his head. That's the feeling I got from that part of philosophy. And what I'd like to do, what I'd like to pursue is to find some kind of a middle ground, and to advance some kind of a culture understanding of culture, a cultural view of cognitive science as well, but a really more general a view of philosophy in this larger sense, but grounded in humans, and humans who are grounded in nature.
Just as a side note, yesterday I attended a Zoom meeting that was, well, it was a lecture of sorts by Christopher, who couldn't make it today, but will be with us next week. And he basically portrayed a cultural and political background of Plessner's, of the time when Plessner wrote and published Stufen. And he also presented some of his cultural and political work that preceded Stufen. So that is possibly also something you might want to delve into, his texts that precede the Stufen and that are more political and sociological in nature. And it was a really interesting presentation, because it kind of went through the some of the most pertinent sociological and political topics that were present in Germany at that particular point. Maybe Christopher can say a few words on that, you know, in our subsequent sessions. So next up is Matthias.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Matthias. In my early 20s, I went to India for a very long time. It wasn't planned to be that long. It was planned like half a year, but the time sort of kept growing for maybe 7 or 8 years. And I ended up studying Tibetan language and the Buddhist tradition, Tibetan Buddhist tradition, very deeply, and also practicing it for a long time. Before, with 30, I figured out, oh no, this is not the path to secure retirement that I'm pursuing here. Even though it feels great, but this is not going to work out so well. And I got the offer to work here in Austria as a translator, which I did. And I also teach a little bit of Buddhism, like it's, you know, not too much. But yeah, that's my work and background basically. And I started also studying the Western tradition, like mainly philosophy. And I met Sebastian during Mind and Life last year. And he invited me to this reading group, and I was very happy to join. I read Science in the Modern World in German, maybe 3 years ago. And I think reading it again now, I will understand a bit more. It wasn't too hard. Actually, somebody said, this is the right book to start, like Matt also mentioned. This is a good introduction to Whitehead, because when you're you know, when you move in the Buddhist world, let's say in the West, and you try to find thinkers that you can engage with without completely being baffled by this other system of thought, then Whitehead always comes up as somebody who is at least similar in some regards. But I also tried to read Process and Reality, and I just gave up after 20 pages. I think it felt like reading Nagarjuna the first time. And I didn't feel I have the same amount of inspiration and strength to go through that experience again. But maybe, and I hope so, through this reading group, I'll reconsider, which is, I think, plausible. Okay.
You didn't see Nibbana at the other end, huh? At the end of Process and Reality.
No, I didn't also have the right, maybe, group or teachers, because, you know, Nagarjuna, you have a living tradition, and you can be very inspired by the teachers of the tradition. So you're like, okay, I stick with it.
Well,
but
you have one living teacher here now. So Matt is becoming something of a Whiteheadian scholar, so in his own right. So and he just published a book. So there you have it. Thanks for this, Matthias. Now.
You were muted when you chose the next person, I think. So.
Oh, sorry. Next up is Adnan.
Hello, everyone. I'm Adnan. I'm currently doing my master's thesis on essentially a Merleau-Pontian or an activist take on the contemporary debate on the minimal self under Sebastian. And I suppose the main reason why I am part of this group is, of course, that Sebastian and I are translating Science in the Modern World into Slovene. So seems pretty self-explanatory.
Thanks, Adnan. There's so many other things you work on, but that was very modest. Well, Adnan. Okay, so next up is Evan.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I know many of you, but not all of you. So I'm Evan Thompson, and I am in British Columbia. I'm actually in the mountains, deep in the mountains right now for the rest of the summer. We're undergoing an extreme heat wave, as I think probably Matt is experiencing as well, if you're in the Bay Area, which is kind of scary. But it's also beautiful. I work in philosophy and cognitive science and phenomenology. I am a professor at the University of British Columbia, and I've had an interest in Whitehead for a very long time. As I mentioned, I was introduced to Whitehead really young through my dad, and I've read him over the years at different times. You know, I studied him as an undergraduate and kind of put him down when I was in grad school, and then picked him up at different points, but I've recently picked him up again. And the reason for picking him up again now is that I'm working on a book with two physicists. One is a astrophysicist, Adam Frank, and the other is a theoretical physicist, Marcelo Gleiser. We're writing a book together about science and human experience. And Whitehead has turned out to be a major figure for us throughout the book. The basic idea of the book is that it's in a way an idea that we see very clear in Husserl in The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, that modern science develops through abstraction and idealization and special controlled situations where we sequester phenomena and we shield them from influences, and we measure and we manipulate them. And then we make this move that Husserl calls the surreptitious substitution, which is that we then substitute the mathematical abstractions and idealizations for concrete reality in the form of perceptual experience, or we substitute the special setting of the Scientific Research Institute for the larger cosmos or the life world. And in doing this, we repeatedly commit the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, to use Whitehead's term. We bifurcate nature. And so we're writing in this book a kind of narrative about how this happens across a number of different scientific domains, and are thinking about matter and time and life and cosmology and mind and consciousness, and ending with the planetary system of Earth and the climate crisis. And so, as I say, Whitehead kind of looms large for us as a figure who really rethinks all of these topics that we're concerned with, life and time and mind and consciousness, and in a way that really points forward to a kind of ecological philosophy. So for these reasons, I've picked Whitehead up again, and I've been rereading him and reading, some works that have appeared in recent years about him that I hadn't read, including Matt's book, which I just got and brought with me to the mountains. And so I'm really looking forward to this reading group, because I'm actively reading Whitehead now, and it's really fun to talk about Whitehead, both with people who are quite knowledgeable, but also people who are encountering Whitehead for the first time with their own passions, their own motivations, their own reasons for doing so. So I'm looking forward to this quite a bit for those reasons. So thanks for inviting me to be part of this, Sebastian.
Thank you for taking the time, Evan. I mean, this is truly an honor. So thank you for being here. And it's interesting that you mentioned Husserl, because if you remember, Matt, at one point when you were having a seminar on Whitehead and Goethe, this is the analogy I drew, that whenever, and this is also something me and Miha were also talking about at one point, whenever you read Whitehead, or whenever I read Whitehead, I get this, feeling of a certain similarity with Husserl. The way he writes some of the things, the way he tends to present some of his ideas in a very specific and somewhat dense manner. But then also, for instance, when I was reading Science and the Modern World, I couldn't but help think also about The Crisis of the European Sciences by Husserl. I mean, they cover similar ground. They approach some of the things in a very, very similar way. It's just incredible. I mean, the similarities between the two authors sometimes are just overwhelming. And it would be so interesting. One of the dialogues that I would really like to see happen, if this were possible, to have, you know, Husserl and Whitehead. Now, I'm not sure whether people in the audience would enjoy it that much, because as Matt can tell us, the Process and Reality lectures didn't really, weren't really hotcakes, so to speak. But it would be definitely interesting to get then afterwards a transcript and then study it meticulously. Yeah, Evan, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I've been thinking about the relationship between these two thinkers a lot because of the, you know, the work I've been doing, the writing I've been doing. And so they were both mathematicians. That their home training and home fields was mathematics, different areas of mathematics, but you know, both trained to think in terms of the, you know, the mathematical way of thinking and constructing systems and demonstrations. They, you know, they both had strong experiences as a result of World War I. You know, Husserl lost his sons in World War I. Husserl gave the crisis lectures. He couldn't give them in Germany because he was already barred from teaching because he was of, you know, Jewish origin. So he gave the crisis lectures in Prague and Vienna. You know, Whitehead wasn't exiled in that way, but he gave, you know, the Process and Reality lectures not in his home country. You know, these are their end stage life ending works, Process and Reality and Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. And as far as I know, they knew nothing about each other. They don't refer to each other, as far as I know, in their writings ever. You know, one would have to verify this in terms of archives because there's huge archives for Husserl, and you know, Whitehead's papers are only now really sort of being systematically gone through. But as far as I know, there are no references to each other. There are bridge figures like Bergson. You know, Husserl writes about Bergson. Bergson and Whitehead knew each other. Bergson was also, as I mentioned earlier, you know, first trained as a mathematician, though he then kind of leaves mathematics. You know, Russell, Wittgenstein, you know, other figures involved in mathematics.
There's also James.
And there's William James, who's another kind of bridge figure. So there are these interesting intermediate connecting figures when we think about Husserl and Whitehead, but they're two thinkers who don't refer to each other and who both really confront, yeah, that's right. There's Winthrop Bell. Yeah. So they might, for that reason, and also I think Dorian Cairns, who worked with Husserl, knew about Whitehead, may have heard some of Whitehead's lectures at Harvard. So they probably, you know, knew of each other, but don't refer to each other. And yet they were both in a way concerned with the same fundamental problem, which is a crisis problem. It's a cultural crisis problem. And so it's utterly fascinating to me that, you know, we have these two, you know, mathematicians who are confronting, you know, the same kinds of questions and giving in some ways similar answers and in other ways very different answers.
For sure, yeah.
So hopefully, you know, we might talk about this some as we you know, work through Whitehead.
This would be very interesting. I mean, also at a certain point, you know, a parallel reading of, I don't know, either Science of the Modern World and the Crisis of the European Sciences, that would be also a very interesting undertaking. Anyway, okay, Timotei.
Hi everyone, I'm Timotei. I'm a doctoral PhD student here in Ljubljana. My mentor is also Sebastian. And my research basically includes mostly like cognitive science, mostly in activism and the extended mind hypothesis I'm really interested in. And also I've dabbled a bit in predictive processing lately. And on the other hand, like philosophical authors such as Simondon, Merleau-Ponty, Whitehead, Deleuze. So you could say a kind of, I'm interested in a kind of a process ontology, most generally said, which implies also a kind of process epistemology, one could say. So my research thesis is about affectivity, or you could also say maybe naturalized normativity, which I try to explore mostly through the notions of autopoiesis and the extended mind. So try to think about the self-organization and plasticity of affective agents or something like that. That would be a bottom line. So I think it's pretty self-evident why I would be interested in Whitehead in many of these respects.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think that Whitehead in general, when people get to know him, realize that he can be extremely useful for many different things. So even if you don't become like, say, 100% Whiteheadian or whatnot, and if you don't pursue necessarily some of the lines of inquiry that he himself was pursuing, you still can get a lot of merit from just wrestling with his philosophy, wrestling with his thoughts. So a very, very prolific and useful thinker. Okay, Mika and Eva, whichever way you want to do it.
Yeah, first of all, I'm very stoked to be here, that we're finally doing Whitehead. I actually came across Whitehead first when I was doing my undergraduate work on Jonas. And actually through Jonas, I fell in love with Whitehead, really, because he was a kind of background character in his phenomena of life, always present. He was really, I guess, always referencing him more or less explicitly. I guess my other interest is probably also biology, I guess from a philosophical point of view. And I guess Whitehead here for me is a kind of interesting figure because, well, as was mentioned before already, his philosophy is a cosmology, right? And this idea that you can think of an organism or a concept of an organism, right? Like Jonas would do, but think of it in a cosmological way, right? Or through this optic of a cosmology is, I guess, very fascinating to me. Currently, I guess, besides Whitehead, I have become very interested in Samuel Alexander, who Whitehead is actually also referencing here in Science in Modern World, who again is one of those very interesting figures who I have not come across before reading Whitehead. And it really caught me off guard when I first started reading his Space-Time in Deity, which I think it's not too much to say that's probably, at least to my knowledge, the closest thing that exists to processing reality. So honestly, if processing reality had like something else for its subtitle, for instance, processing reality, space-time in deity, I wouldn't actually bat an eye. Like that would be completely convincing to me, actually. Yeah, that's probably. And of course, I'm currently enrolled in the MA program here in the University of Ljubljana. Yeah.
Okay, so hi everybody, I'm Eva, and I'm quite new to philosophy. Otherwise, I'm a field biologist, and specifically I work with plants. So, for example, I guide some terrains for the students who are interested in botanics. And I find the upcoming cycle of Epoché to be a really welcome push for me to start reading Whitehead, since I have been acquainted with his ideas for a while now, or some of his ideas and like the basics of them. And so I'm really glad to be able to devote some of my time now in the summer to get to know these ideas more profoundly.
Yeah, I can also say for that Mika is probably the most, how do you put it, like enthusiastic or avid Whiteheadian in the group. He works most intensely and most actively on Whitehead at the moment. Aside from now, Matt, of course. Matt is the towering figure at this point, and Evan probably to a certain degree as well. But in the metanoia group, Miha takes the lead when it comes to Whitehead. Okay, and then we have Neo, and I forgot the name because he is here for the first time, so I'm terribly sorry for this.
I'm gonna let him introduce himself.
Yeah, hi everyone. Really glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to discussing Whitehead with you. My name is Max, and I'm a graduate of media studies. I'm an editor of SHUM, let's say theory fiction journal, and a blogger. And mostly now I'm interested in philosophy for quite some time, and I try to test these concepts that we find in academia in, I don't know, culturally contemporary setting, and see how they travel from one context to another. So probably Whitehead could work in this manner as well. And yeah, that's my background.
Thanks, Max, and I'm really sorry for having forgotten your name.
No
I
problem.
apologize.
Yes, my name is Enea. I'm studying philosophy, and actually Sebastian invited me because he is my professor and my mentor for my diploma, and he invited me here probably because I defended Vienna Circle at one of his subjects, and one thing led to another. And yeah, I'm interested in, I guess, I wrote my diploma thesis on Reza Negarestani, philosophy and land on intelligence, and what it means that we are dealing with artificial intelligence. And yeah, I'm just enjoying this reading group because it helps me process all this philosophical information, because there is so much going on, and I just love reading. Like we read Candilem and now Whitehead. I'm very excited.
Yeah, I have to comment on that Vienna Circle reference. I think this was the very first time in my history and philosophy of science class that a student actively decided to defend Vienna Circle. So normally that never happens. There are maybe occasional affinities, but even then they are quite, they are usually withdrawn, or they're qualified. But Enea was provided a really interesting defense and a very unique reading of the Vienna Circle. It was a neo-Kantian reading, which I found interesting, faulty in many regards, but interesting. So, and yeah, that wasn't the only reason why I invited Enea, because she's interested in so many different things. Both she and Max, they are very interested in this neo-rationalist movement that is, and I don't know what the proper terms are, but it's also something that I would like to kind of be more informed about, because it seems to be quite prominent in certain philosophical circles, and it's growing in influence. And so, yeah, it would be interesting to see any productive bridges made between that and some of the authors that we're working on here. Matt, you're next.
Thanks, Seb. Yeah, I'm Matt Siegel, and I teach at California Institute of Integral Studies, which the campus is in San Francisco, though I teach online graduate courses for a program called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness, very interdisciplinary, if not transdisciplinary, and my scholarship reflects that. I publish a lot on Whitehead, but also, I'm very interested in the sort of what you could call like the evolution of religion, and being in San Francisco at CIS, it's hard not to enter into dialogue with people studying psychedelics. And so I've published a bit about the import of psychedelics for consciousness studies. I'm also doing research now on a new subject that's rather relevant to our moment. I'm studying collapsology because I'm teaching a course on this, co-teaching a course on this in the fall. And yeah, not much good news coming out of that study, but it's fascinating to see historically how civilizations have risen and fallen, and to try to understand our present predicament. What else to say? I guess Evan and Seb have already plugged my book a few times, but I'm excited that this Physics of the World Soul, Whitehead's Adventure of Cosmology was just released, which I think serves as a fair introduction to Whitehead, though it's not hagiography by any means. It is really trying to apply Whitehead's ideas to contemporary science, physics, biology, complexity theory, and just to show how a Whiteheadian framework can help us integrate what would otherwise remain fragmented scientific perspectives, so that we can really take in the universe as a whole in light of modern science, but with a more organic, in the Whiteheadian sense, metaphysics, with which I think sheds new light upon the way that these different fragmented scientific disciplines can be integrated. So yeah, that's me.
Marvelous, Matt, and thank you so much for also being willing to participate in this reading group. Yeah, it's really, again, an honor to have you on board, especially, as I said, given the fact that you've become quite a Whiteheadian scholar, and as you said, you're kind of slowly becoming slightly fed up with Whitehead and would like to move on to the greener pastures. Not sure whether they're greener or not, but to other pastures at least. But I hope that this will be worth your while here, the discussions that we'll have in this group. Victoria, you're next.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a PhD student in the field of philosophy in the University of Ljubljana. So a little bit about my background. So I did my master's in cognitive science in Ljubljana and Vienna, and also I have a bachelor's in behavioral neuroscience or biopsychology. So I'm basically this mix of science and philosophy currently. And very broadly, I'm currently interested in phenomenology, contemplative practices, and first-person research and empirical phenomenology, mainly the microphenomenological interview technique. In my research, I am basically just focusing on phenomenological philosophy and empirical approaches to the observation of lived experience. And as my doctoral thesis, I am exploring the role of reflective attitudes in the thematization of lived experience. So concerning Whitehead, I'm basically encountering Whitehead for the first time really thoroughly and head on in this reading group. I basically became familiar with Whitehead through YouTube a few years ago, about a year and a half or 2 years ago, through Matt's YouTube channel. As I was looking through like different philosophical and interesting things to listen to. So yeah, and I found those ideas really interesting. So here I am now. And I hope like this reading group and discussion will help me dive deeper and really discuss different ideas and outlooks, and also bring my attention to things that I might have or would have overlooked had I only read this book on my own. So yeah.
Marvelous, Victoria. As already mentioned, Adnan, Timotei, and Victoria in this group, they are part of the Epoché from the very get-go. So from the structure of behavior onwards, when we were still meeting in Timotei's old flat, small flat, that couldn't house more than, what, 5 people then. Okay, thanks, Victoria. Next up, Martin Justin. I had to say the last name because it rhymes.
Hi. So, hi everybody, my name is Martin. I'm just finishing my undergrad studies here in Ljubljana from philosophy and comparative literature. I wrote my undergrad thesis on Merleau-Ponty's conception of induction, which was mentored by Sebastian. And I'm planning to now do an MA in philosophy also here in Ljubljana. I'm generally interested in philosophy of science. And I know nothing about Whitehead as of now, so I thought this might be a good starting point for me to get into Whitehead philosophy. As for my other interests, I also work as a literary critic, but I don't know yet how I might connect these two areas of professional life for me. So yeah, just here as a philosophy student.
Just would like to say that the thesis on the inductive method was really interesting, Merleau-Ponty's critique. So we said that we will follow up on that in the upcoming months with further research. Anyway, now I'm probably going to mangle this name, so I apologize profusely. Khridija.
Yeah, it's Redija.
Khridija, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Quite perfect. Yeah. Matt invited me to this reading group. My background is in space exploration systems. So I come from a science and engineering background. I think it was towards my master's thesis that I was quite disappointed with the limitations of modern science and wanted to study the history of science and how the ideas evolved. And that is when I came across a polemic of Kepler and Flood, and which kind of got me more interested in cosmology, but also how psychological attitudes of various intellectuals affect cosmological discourses. And then I took some courses in Buddhism and psychology, and currently I'm doing a PhD project, like a doctoral research project on how the mind matter ideas of early and mid 20th century, how they have had their impact on cosmological discourses, and particularly evidenced in the correspondence between Carl Gustav Jung and Wolfgang Pauli. And there's a third part, which is kind of looking at these variations of ideas affecting cosmological discourses in obviously 20th century Western intellectual history, but also at the background of non-Western cosmologies, particularly the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that was a kind of a long-term companion of Carl Gustav Jung. So like dealing with different domains and how they relate to each other. I got interested in Whitehead, of course, because he's a crucial figure of the time when it comes to cosmology and also transforming the mind matter problem in different ways. I sense a kind of fluidity, a logically consistent fluidity actually in his work, which is very extraordinary. And therefore, I think his work is also kind of in many ways central to my project. Yeah.
Marvelous. Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you for being here. I hope these seminars are useful to you as well. Okay, last on the list but not least, Ula.
Hi, my name is Ula, and I'm currently, as well as Martin, finishing up my studies here at University of Ljubljana. I'm a student of philosophy and sociology, and Sebastian is my mentor of my diploma in philosophy. I'm interested in, I'm not sure how to formulate it, but I think in sociology, in this problem or this opposition between structure and agency. And I think that I've noticed this problem in many areas. And yes, this is something that I'm drawn to. Yeah, that's pretty much, that's all I know about my interest so far. I have heard of Whitehead sometimes, and I thought this was a great opportunity to discover him more. And I guess I'm an example of those students that don't know much about Whitehead, but know that something is happening, so they have to know more. So when Sebastian invited me, I was really excited, and I said yes. And that's all.
Whitehead is becoming like Bitcoin. Whitehead is the you know, if Bitcoin was what the Whitehead of 2012 or something like that, then Whitehead is the Bitcoin of 2021. So people just hear about it, and then where can I buy me some Bitcoin? Where can I go and read and discuss on Whitehead?
Everyone's aping in all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Although Whitehead scholarship is not as profitable, I must say.
Well, you know, Bitcoin was not that profitable either at the very beginning. So anyway, so I think I'm last. So you've seen that there is a common denominator among many people here. So I'm guessing you all know me. Sebastian Vörös is the name, assistant professor of philosophy at the Department of Philosophy here in Ljubljana. I have many different interests, so I won't go into them. Currently, I'm really interested in the phenomenon of life. Both, I'm going to use these terms somewhat loosely, and I'm not particularly fond of them, but both from the first person and third person perspective, that is to say, science as the object of inquiry and science as something that is constitutive of my aliveness, so something that constitutes, say, my lived sphere, so to speak, and how these different perspectivities interrelate. And the reason why I'm interested in this is because one of the, you know, we all have certain philosophical problems, certain chestnuts that haunt us in one way or another, and usually they are sedimentation of certain existential questions that plague us. And one of the questions in the philosophical realm that is really important to me, and that I've been really heavily involved in, is the question of the subject-object dichotomy, or better phrase, the subject versus the world. So how can a consciousness be embedded into the world? And I think that the phenomenon of life is one way to approach this dichotomy in a way that might help perhaps bridge this seeming abyss or gap, chasm, if you like. And Whitehead is just one of the authors that I find extremely useful in this regard. I'm being, in a certain sense, you might say, existentially curious with regards to who might be helpful with the topics that I'm interested in. And one of the things that I would really like to explore is precisely what Evan also mentioned, but perhaps even on a larger scale. So to touch upon some of the similarities and parallels between Whitehead and certain other authors, between Whitehead's ideas and concepts and notions, and the ideas and notions developed by certain other authors. And as my students all know all too well, Merleau-Ponty is the author, is a go-to author for me. I'm currently experiencing a similar malaise as Matt was describing. So I too have slightly become, I don't know, fed up is too strong a word, but it's just, I've read Phenomenology of Perception and the Structure of Behavior so many times now. You know, I also read other works, but I think that I'm really happy when I have the opportunity to delve into something like this, or something like this, for instance. And Whitehead is another author that I'm really happy to kind of supplement my current investigations with. Anyway, that's my description in a nutshell. Now, before we say goodbye, I would like to say that I think there are 3 or 4 people. Yes, for sure, nature. We already talked about this with Matt, and maybe nature will be also one of the texts that we will be working on. Not maybe necessarily the whole book, because the last fourth of the book is really just, it's hardly understandable. It's more or less fragments that you can hardly decipher. But first 3/4, that would be extremely interesting. Merleau-Ponty's reflections on Schelling and Merleau-Ponty's reflections on Whitehead. That's just, and his interesting analysis of Uexküll, extremely useful. Anyway, that's beside the point. But nature, for sure, extremely marvelous series of lectures. So the general structure of our sessions is as follows. We usually begin with a short recap of the readings. So usually this takes 15 to 20 minutes. It can even be shorter if somebody would like to have a more, to the point presentation. It can be even 10 minutes. But that is just to kind of guide us into the topic. And after that, we have an approximately 60 to 90 minute long discussion on this. And the person that is presenting the readings usually also at least slightly prepares the potential questions. But we can, take the discussions anywhere we would like. So that's not really something that is predetermined. That is the general outline. So in the email, I sent you an approximate timeline, and we're still missing presenters for, I think, 3 sessions. So if anybody would like to give this a go, you're more than welcome to add your name into the Excel spreadsheet. Please bear in mind that, as you've now seen, most of us are not Whitehead experts, so no need to worry with regards to, your proficiency in Whitehead's philosophy. So that shouldn't be an issue, because except for Matt and Evan and Miha, most of us we've just been dabbling in Whitehead's philosophy or are completely new to this. So don't think that you really have to be an expert on Whitehead for you to be able to do a short presentation. As Matt mentioned, and also Matthias referred to this, I think that this is the most accessible of all Whitehead's books, and from what I know. And there are certain parts that are more difficult, for sure, but many of the chapters, and the chapter on abstraction, I've kind of isolated that chapter. So with other chapters, we do 2 chapters per session, per meeting, but with this one, I just have reserved this for one person, no, I combined this with another section, which is also quite difficult, and I'm kind of hoping that this is something that Matt would be willing to present, because these are the 2 most difficult. Matt also says that they're the function of reason and religion in the making, that they're even more digestible, apparently. Possibly, I do not know those works. So yeah, from among the most well-known works, this would be probably the best way to start, right?
Yeah, I just mentioned those 2 because they are very short. You could read them in a day, probably. So if anyone wanted to follow up on the study of science in the modern world, those 2 are great. Yeah, Modes of Thought is pretty accessible. Yeah, that's a later work where Whitehead is being a bit more aphoristic at times and kind of, you know, he's not as jargon filled in that book, Modes of Thought. So yeah, that's a good late text as well. But yeah, we're starting with the right book.
Marvelous. Okay, so any comments, questions before we say goodbye? No? Okay, marvelous. It was nice seeing you all. Just so that you know, the next session is up already next week. And then after that, we have, we meet every 14 days, so every 2 weeks. Okay, next week is an exception. Okay, thanks again for being here. Have a marvelous day. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Thanks.